Hi, I'm James Cooper, professor of law at Anton Scalia Law School and the director of the program on economics and privacy. Welcome to another in our series of PEP Talks, where we hear from leading researchers in the field of the economics of privacy. Joining me today are Ginger Jin, professor of economics at the University of Maryland, and Liad Wagman, professor of economics at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Both are also FTC alums. Ginger was the director of the Bureau of Economics, and Liad served as a senior technical and economic advisor in the Office of Policy Planning. So Ginger and Liad have graciously agreed to talk to us about some of their recent research, along with their co-author, Jian Jia, that looks at the impact of GDPR on investment. So Ginger and Liad, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, great. So first, can you talk a little bit about the GDPR and how you might think it would have an impact on investment? Now, I realize we could spend an hour or a month on unpacking the GDPR, but just briefly, how the parts of the GDPR that you think might impact incentives to invest.
Okay, maybe I can start. I think GDPR has defined a broad set of user rights, including users need to give informed opt-in consent for data collection. They have the rights to access data, to know data breach, to be forgotten, and to have portability in their own data. And there are also articles in GDPR that being specific on enforcement and process. For example, the firms are supposed to have privacy by design, and if they're big enough, they need to provide training and have privacy officer in-house. And if a firm is in violation of GDPR, they could be subject to pretty heavy penalty, up to 4% of the firm's global revenue. And this could affect venture, especially a startup venture, in a lot of ways. If we're thinking the venture just in expected profit, it could be higher compliance costs in GDPR would lower that profit, and maybe limited data access or change data quality. Different customers may use their product differently because of GDPR. All these could change the potential revenue of that venture. In addition to that, the competition between ventures and established firms could be changed as well because of GDPR. For example, users may be more comfortable leaving their data with an established firm that they already have a relationship, but they may be more reluctant to share the data with a new venture who is proposing a new product or services. So that's from the venture's perspective. From the consumer's perspective, it could be that consumers really welcome this because they now have a control on the privacy and data collection practice, and they are more able to exercise control over their own data. However, the same consumers could also encounter new market conditions that they don't like. Maybe the price will be higher after the firms have to comply with GDPR, for example, or maybe the innovations would be the set of innovative products and services available to them will be different because of GDPR. So all these could affect a venture's expected profits and therefore the investors' willingness to invest in those ventures to begin with.
Right. I can maybe add a little bit. I think Ginger covered a good portion here. The regulation itself introduced a lot of uncertainty regarding what constitutes compliance in certain cases. And this is in addition to the compliance costs themselves for what is understood. Investors are already investing in startups that have a very uncertain future. And adding more complexity, more uncertainty into that can really force them to consider their options and maybe invest somewhere else. For startups who are just getting in, this sort of uncertainty can also disrupt entire business models. So not just lead to uncertainty with regards to compliance costs, but also as far as feasibility altogether of whether the business model can go through. And obviously the same from investors' perspectives who are looking at the bigger picture, where they put their investment dollars and so on. And this is not just our sort of assumptions here. We did see the largest corporations on track to spending billions of dollars in terms of compliance costs. we also saw some established firms altogether turn off their data hoses from EU users because they just weren't sure how to handle compliance. The smaller firms are also dependent on many of the larger firms' policies, if those firms are platforms. And there is, at least at the time before GDPR came into effect, was rolled out, there was uncertainty regarding how their compliance is going to shape up. And so that led to downstream uncertainty for the startups that rely on those technologies. So altogether, the regulation, as it came to be, introduced a lot of uncertainty. And we saw that even in the days after it was implemented, where many cases came to court, there was a backlog of cases, and the courts themselves needed to figure out how enforcement is going to shake out.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, so there's this confluence of supply side, demand side factors coupled with uncertainty. So a lot of reasons to expect that the GDPR is likely to have an impact, but I guess the empirical question is what's that impact going to be, which gets me to talk about your the first paper I want to talk about, published in Marketing Science, called The Short Run Effects of GDPR and Technology Venture Investment. So, you know, again, it sounds like a fairly complicated ecosystem. What data did you use to get at this question? And you know, number two is how did you attempt to identify the causal impact of GDPR on these investment decisions?
Maybe I can tackle the first part, and Ginger, you can do the second. As far as the data, we have two primary sources. One is the Crunchbase database. Crunchbase is used in a variety of economic literatures. It's also been used by the Federal Trade Commission, for example, in its recent 6B study on non-HSR reportable transactions. It's also been used by the majority staff report from the House of Representatives that focused on large technology firms. And the current FTC chair was part of the team that wrote that report. The other database we used is part of Refinitiv Workspace. In academic settings, it's sometimes known as SDC Platinum. Refinitiv was spun out of Thomson Reuters. It offers a variety of financial tools and services, and as well as a comprehensive data set. The Crunchbase dataset has a feature where it crowdsources some of the information subject to staff verification. And so it covers more of the smaller transactions, the ones that are often what we call seed fundraising deals. Whereas Venture Expert focuses more on the later funding rounds, which are primarily Series A, Series B, and later. The two datasets do have some overlap, and we account for that in our analysis. I'll turn it over to Ginger.
Thank you, Liad. Given GDPR was rolled out in May 2018, it's tempting to just look at the data before and after that period and see the difference might be the causal effect. However, that kind of approach is subject to a few caveats. For example, there could be ongoing trend or different things happening at different time. And all these could have nothing to do with GDPR, but would be embedded in the before and after comparison. So if we just do the single difference, it could be including those now relevant effects and mistakenly call them to be the impact of GDPR. So in light of that potential caveat, we try to find a control group. So ideally, you want a control group to be kind of another part of the world that's completely insulated from GDPR, but however follow similar trend as EU, so that we can use the comparison between EU and the rest of the world to sort of difference out the irrelevant factors. In reality, things are not as clean. Like, for example, the GDPR actually would apply to global firms who have users in EU. So in that sense, you can imagine some big US-based firms probably are subject to GDPR because they're serving EU citizens as well. And some countries may have similar laws, not exactly same law, but may have similar laws, like GDPR would govern sort of firm behavior and venture investment in those markets as well. So we did our best to try to find a clean comparison group with EU. So in main parts of our analysis, we basically compare EU-based ventures to US-based ventures. In robustness checks, we also compare EU-based ventures with the rest of the world, the ventures based on the rest of the world. Our data, as Liad described, ranges from 2014 to the end of 2019. So that would have 2 years before the enactment of GDPR in 2016. We have about 2-year interim period between enactment and the rollout, and then about 1.5 years after its eventual rollout in May of 2018. So the method, you can imagine, that is basically difference in differences in the econ language, right? One level of difference is EU versus a control group such as US and the rest of the world. And the other difference is before and after the different timeline I just described.
And so, so and that methodology, I think, is used quite often in economics to come up with plot to identify causal impacts, and with, as long as your treatment and control groups prior to the impact follow the parallel trends assumption, then and in your work it appears to satisfy that, then you end up with this nice a way to identify the causal impact of GDPR on investments. So what are your main findings then? So you have this nice experiment, you have this nice empirical design. What do you guys find?
So our biggest finding is that after GDPR was rolled out in May 2018, we see about a 26% reduction in the number of monthly venture deals by EU ventures as compared to their US counterparts. And these results are robust if we compare against the rest of the world, for example. And we also find the negative effects are larger in the first 6 months, right after the GDPR's rollout in 2018, but some of them still persistent in 2019 and even in 2020 in our later research, as our later research have shown. And these effects, as we would expect, is more negative for consumer-facing ventures rather than business-facing ventures. Is more negative for data-intensive ventures as compared to ventures that are not so intensive in data use. Is also more negative for ventures in earlier stage.
So, so I know that you did some follow-on research as well that looks at the impact, with not just the heterogeneous impacts with respect to industry that you just talked about, Ginger, but also on the source of the investment, right? So, I guess can you talk a little bit about how this research question differs, or kind of what you're looking at in this paper in particular, as opposed to your marketing science paper? And then how, again, sort of how you the data you used and the methodology, if it was similar or different.
Right. Maybe I can say a little bit. It's a very similar methodology. We did divide and focus on the investor group and divided them into subgroups. So one of the subgroups are domestic investors. Those are investors that are basically located in the same state or same member state in the EU. Another group is what we call same union investors. They're located in different states or member states, but they're in the same union, either in the US or in the EU. And another is what we call foreign investors. And those are investors that are located in an entirely different union from the venture in which they're investing. And then we followed a similar analysis, and we found that the impact of GDPR on foreign investors is much more pronounced than on same union and domestic or same state investors. And it held pretty much across the board, whether we looked at early stage funding or younger ventures or more data focused ventures or more consumer facing ventures. the result extended, it was still negative for all three investor groups, but more so for the ones that are more distant than the ventures.
Okay, and so I know that you've taken this research and you've started to look at, or not started, but you have looked at a longer period, a longer post GDPR enactment period. And some of this research was recently published in the antitrust source. So what do you all find there? I mean, do the results that you have, from seem to hold up over the long run, or was this just a short run phenomena?
I guess the answer is probably both. We extend our data to the end of 2020. The data still start from 2014 till the end of 2020. And in that antitrust source article, we compare EU versus US. What we find is that the magnitude of the negative impact of GDPR on venture investment has been decreasing over time. So just to give you the some magnitude here, the number of venture deals dropped about 32% in EU versus US in about 15 months after rollout, but that drop is a little less, it's only negative 11% in the next 15 months. So the negative effect is still persist, but the magnitude of that negative effect seems to be a little smaller after 1+ years.
Do you have any thoughts as to why that might be the case? Is I realize early on you all had talked about, Liad, you talked in particular about the uncertainty being a big driver, perhaps a reduction in investment. Do you think some of the uncertainty is going away now that people have seen the GDPR in effect now for a little over 4 years and getting a better feel for what the enforcement posture of some of these local DPAs might be, or including maybe it's not as bad. Maybe the GDPR isn't going to be as bad as we thought it would be. And I'm thinking about that in conjunction. There's some work with Garrett Johnson and others have found a short run impact of the GDPR as far as firms wanting to, as far as it looks like vendors, large vendors sort of benefiting in the short run, but maybe in the longer run, there's a little bit of a, we're not as scared as we once were. Maybe we know a little bit more. I just wondered if you have any conjectures, or you don't want to go beyond. Yeah, I can completely appreciate if you don't want to go beyond what the data say as well.
Yeah, I think it would be conjectures. What we do see in the data that there's been an uptick, although in the grand scheme of things, this is a very small group of data and security focused ventures. So it is entirely plausible that both GDPR has become better understood over time, and there's some clarity and less uncertainty. It's also possible that compliance costs have marginally decreased due to the emergence of solutions for compliance purposes. The truth is, we don't know exactly, but we do know that there have been a number of factors that are associated with GDPR that led to some reaction from investors and ventures. And those factors have been at least somewhat attenuated over time. And
we have to admit that, I mean, the world is moving on, right? That's maybe thanks to the pandemic, the digital economy has been increasing. That's more and more of our daily activities are online now, and which rely a lot on data sharing, data collection, and data usage. So that alone probably have changed the demand of venture money in the business, and also how business deal with their data practice and the privacy concerns. There are some research sort of showing that even if we are concerned that the GDPR has made the data and tracking more difficult, because some people may just instruct the firm not to track them. So
Mhm.
the number of individual identifiable information is less to the firm. However, at least in one case, a online intermediary has found that the remaining consumers who are willing to give the consent to the firm turns out to be more valuable in terms of advertising value. So we not only see the volume of data sharing is different, and also the nature of data sharing and the type of data available to the firms might be different after GDPR. So all these factors could contribute to sort of a lesser degree of effect, as we have seen in our work.
Oh,
Right.
so I'm sorry, Leah, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was going to add that there are a lot that we will never know. We would never know the firms that were, for instance, not formed in the EU and maybe formed elsewhere or failed to be formed at all as a result of the short run effects. So in some sense, these short run effects can be over the long run if certain ventures that could have transformed the EU along some business vertical failed to materialize as a result of the regulation. Now that the reverse can also be true. It could be that the regulation helped form some venture that will transform the EU. So there are things we just won't know. But what we do know is that there's a significant portion that, at least in the years immediately after the role of GDPR, failed to materialize or materialized elsewhere than in the EU.
And to add on that, I think some of the regulatory actions may help to clarify some of the uncertainty at the very beginning of GDPR rollout. There are cases from different member states of EU on GDPR compliance that may give some clarity on sort of what are in the violation zone, what are in the non-violation zone, and with that like reduced uncertainty, maybe investors feel more comfortable rather than just wait and see. So this could be another potential factors explaining our results.
Right.
Well, thanks. I mean, we could spend all day talking about your fascinating research, but I do before we end this, this is clearly important research, and what I'd like to ask both of you is, in light of the work you've done and maybe this particular work, but of course you've both done a lot of work in these areas in other papers, and you're both have served at the FTC for that matter. What advice would you have for policymakers in the U.S. that are currently considering various privacy proposals? I mean, we know, of course, the FTC is considering this advance notice of proposed rulemaking on the surveillance economy, which it isn't really a crystal clear rule, but we do know they're considering rulemaking in this space. We know that there are a couple bills percolating on Capitol Hill that would regulate privacy. So given your research, what advice would you have for policymakers considering some action in this space?
Maybe I can start. One takeaway I had from our research is that we got to consider the impact of regulatory policy, not only consumer privacy, but also the supply side, right? The investor, we find the effects to be different for different investor types, and to be different for different type of ventures, whether it could be big versus small, it could be early stage versus later stage, it could be consumer facing or business facing. I think the supply side, especially the heterogeneity on the supply side, should be incorporated, while policymakers thinking maybe the benefits of such regulations on protecting consumer privacy and maybe more secure data use.
Yeah, I will add that privacy is a very complex area, and I think that it's impossible for any one of us to consider all the different trade-offs. We see through this work the interface between privacy policy and competition, and I think that interface is quite strong, and policymakers should take it into account. On the broader kind of question that you asked, because of this complexity, I think it's any sort of landmark omnibus regulation in this space should really come out of Congress because of all these complexities, because of the different trade-offs. And I think that the FTC is a great institution. It focuses on consumer protection and competition, but it is not Congress, and it does not represent each and every state in the nation. So that's my view.
Yeah, I completely agree with Liad. I think in my view, I think a nationwide law on privacy and data protection is better than each state trying to have its own law. They, as we know, that today's digital economy deal with users in many states, in many countries. It's kind of ridiculous that we now have California version of the law, and we have Virginia version, we have Colorado version, and maybe other states as well. And not only that, we could have financial sector specific law, we could have healthcare specific, and maybe the law only target now adult users, for example. I think with all these piecemeal approach of legislation is really fragmental, and it's add up to the compliance cost for firms. It's not efficient. It also add confusion from consumer users perspective. I would imagine not only compliance, but also enforcement could be quite difficult in this fragmental world.
All right. Well, on that uplifting note, on looking forward, I want to thank both of you again, you for sharing your insights on this very important research, and I appreciate your time. So Ginger and Liad, thank you very much for being part of this pep talk.
Thanks very much.